on offense. President Biden makes it clear he's staying in the race in his first sit-down interview since his first debate performance. But was it enough to quiet his critics? Congresswoman Nikema Williams joins me live as another one of her congressional colleagues calls on the president to drop out. Spotlight on Project 2025, why Donald Trump is trying to distance himself from the plan that's tailor-made for his agenda, and the Biden campaign's stinging response. And new fallout from the Supreme Court's immunity decision. Donald Trump gets a delay in his classified documents case thanks to that ruling and the judge he appointed. I'm Katie Fang, in for Jonathan Capehart, and this is The Saturday Show. The Biden campaign is coming out swinging, pushing back to quiet the noise. But the next several days could be critical. After his debate performance in Atlanta just 9 days ago, a defiant President Biden sat down for his first exclusive interview since his face-off with Donald Trump. And on the campaign trail, he's made it clear he is not stepping aside and plans to win the 2024 election.
Well, let me say this as clear as I can. I'm staying in the race. I'll beat Donald Trump.
And despite that strong statement from Biden, the pressure campaign within his own party to get him to step aside seems to be gaining some steam. Congresswoman Angie Craig of Minnesota is now the 5th House Democrat to call on President Biden to leave the race, saying it's time for, quote, a new generation of leaders. Tomorrow, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries will lead a virtual meeting with Democratic committee ranking members, with the focal point being concerns over Biden's electability. Meanwhile, Senator Mark Warner of Virginia is currently working to organize a group of Democratic senators to discuss a path forward. Nevertheless, Biden remains steadfast in his belief that he is, once again, the right candidate to defeat the twice-impeached, quadruple-indicted, convicted for 34 felonies ex-president. Here's what he had to say yesterday in that exclusive interview with ABC News anchor George Stephanopoulos.
Have you convinced yourself that only you can defeat him?
I convinced myself of two things. I'm the most qualified person to beat him, and I know how to get things done.
If you can be convinced that you cannot defeat Donald Trump, will you stand down?
It depends if the Lord Almighty comes down and tells me that, I might do that.
Joining me now is Congresswoman Nikema Williams of Georgia. She's also the chair of the Georgia Democratic Party. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate your time. First, I wanted to get your reaction to President Biden's interview last night on ABC and his response to all the criticism and the speculation surrounding his ability to win this November.
So, Katie, what I heard in the interview was a president who has a record to run on. President Biden went before the American people in the sit-down interview, and he defended his record, and he talked about the transformational policies that have been enacted over the past 3.5 years. I am here at the Essence Festival in New Orleans with thousands of Black women from across the country, and you know what I'm hearing, Katie? They appreciate the $16 billion that have been invested in HBCUs over the past 3.5 years. They appreciate that Black businesses have grown exponentially over the past 3.5 years. And then we have an alternative. We have someone else on the ballot, twice impeached, 34 felony convictions, who has bragged about overturning Roe v. Wade. So, Katie, it is clear to me before the debate, after the debate, during the debate, and after the interview that our choice and our work is clear here. We must defeat Donald Trump in November. I am keeping my eyes on the prize. That is the goal, and that's what we're going to do.
Biden or bust. So as I mentioned, though, at the beginning, some Democratic lawmakers have called on President Biden to step aside, but you are a congresswoman. Tell me, what are you hearing from your colleagues?
I mean, what I'm hearing is ultimately everyone wants the same thing, Katie. We know that we have to defeat Donald Trump. And no one has a crystal ball to determine what is going to happen in an hour, let alone in November. And so what I do know is that voters understand when policies impact their everyday lives. And President Biden has implemented transformational policies across this country, not for Democratic voters, not for Republican voters, but for everyone in this country. And that's what voters care about most. So my colleagues, they're hearing from people, I'm hearing from people, but at the end of the day, we have a snapshot from polls that have come out in the last 9 days, but we also know that voters have the final say. I represent a deep blue district in a periwinkle state. I fully understand that every vote counts. We have to take our story to the voters because ultimately that's who has the final say, the American voters.
I want to play for you a clip of Senator John Fetterman on MSNBC last night. Take a quick listen.
Donald Trump is back here. And you know what do Democrats do? We panic and piss our pants, after a bad debate. And after 34 convictions, felonies, the Republicans show up and they dress like him and they go all in on Trump. Maybe we could learn something here and just, stand by our president through this.
Congressman, I've been saying this for a while now. Maybe it's time for the Democrats to take a page out of the GOP playbook. They've circled the wagons around the 34 felony convicted, twice impeached, quadruple indicted, liable for sexual abuse nominee. Why are Democrats, though, focusing on only one debate performance instead of really amplifying the successes of that first administration for Joe Biden and to see and to emphasize the importance on Donald Trump, who is such an existential threat to American democracy?
So, Katie, this has become the media narrative for the past 9 days, and that's what people are responding to. And we all saw the debate, so I am not going to pretend that we had a great night on last Thursday. But what I know is that we have 3.5 years of progress that we need to continue to build upon. And the only way to do that is to elect President Joe Biden and send him a Democratic Congress so that we can finish the job. We need to codify Roe v. Wade so that our freedoms are protected. We need to get the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act passed so that we can protect the right to vote for people all over this country. And there is only one way to do that, and that is to make sure that we defeat Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a threat and a danger to our democracy, and so we must remain committed and clear. Some of my colleagues are moving in a different direction, but ultimately our goals are the same: defeating Donald Trump. I am in a battleground state. We understand that every vote counts. We're building multiracial coalitions, talking to all voters about the issues that matter to them. We only won Georgia by 11,780 votes, those votes that Donald Trump tried to get from our Secretary of State when he wanted to overturn the will of the voters and overturn the 2020 election results. But the voters had the final say, Katie, and that's what will happen this November.
I'm glad you brought up those 11,780 votes, because that's exactly, maybe Donald Trump got indicted for that in the state of Georgia for trying to overturn the elections of a lawful 2020 presidential election. I wanted to know for our viewers, you are kindly taking time out of your schedule. You are at Essence Festival right now. Vice President Kamala Harris about to speak there in just a few minutes. What are you expecting to hear from our Vice President about her role in the campaign during this critical period?
So, Katie, I just left the vice president. When she came in, she had a small clutch with a group of CBC members, and we talked with her, and she is getting ready to go on the stage to have a conversation with the CEO of Essence about what this election means for Black women in this country, but how do we build those multiracial coalitions to protect our freedoms, because our freedoms are on the ballot. This is not about one person at the top of the ticket. I love my president and my vice president, and they've done tremendous work, but at the end of the day, this election is not about a single person. It's not about a personality. It's about the issues that each candidate brings to the table, and it's about protecting our freedoms that are on the ballot. So I am looking forward to her addressing a very rowdy crowd here at Essence. We've been living our best lives, Katie, but today and through November, my Black job is protecting democracy, and that's what we're going to continue to do.
I got less than a minute there when I wanted to end with this final question. Project 2025, it's the blueprint for the destruction of democracy if Trump wins in November. President Biden said during that interview last night, quote, "I think the United States and the world is at an inflection point where the things that happen the next several years are going to determine the next 6 or 7 decades, how they look." How can the urgency of that message get across to voters?
Absolutely, Katie. It is scary when you look at some of the things that are in here. But when people show you who they are, Katie, we must believe them the first time, in the words of Maya Angelou. But what we also know is that Donald Trump, whether he tries to distance himself from this Project 25 memo that's been out, we all understand what he said with his own mouth. He cheered and celebrated overturning Roe v. Wade. Our freedoms are on the line in this election cycle. So we must turn out like we've never turned out before to make sure that we protect our freedoms and re-elect President Joe Biden so that we can move our country forward, not continue to look backwards as Donald Trump tries to continue to divide our country.
Congresswoman Akima Williams, thank you again for taking the time for joining us this evening. I appreciate it very much. And coming up, and right now, actually, you are looking at a live picture of Vice President Kamala Harris. She is at Essence Fest in New Orleans. She's going to be speaking with the CEO of Essence about not only what's going on, the state of our country, but obviously she will be dealing, I think, with some comments of the upcoming election. But again, you're looking at a live picture of Vice President Kamala Harris at Essence Fest in New Orleans. If we get some comments from her, we'll try to bring those to you during the course of tonight's show. And coming up, we're going to get some new reaction to that interview by President Biden last night and Donald Trump's efforts to distance himself from Project 2025, the democracy-busting roadmap for a potential second Trump term. Plus, the Supreme Court's bombshell immunity ruling is already paying off for Donald Trump. We're going to discuss today's twist in his classified documents case.
Again, because I think I understand best what has to be done to take this nation to a completely new level. You know, the next president of the United States, it's not just about whether he or she knows what they're doing. It's not about a conglomerate of people making decisions. It's about the character of the president. The character of the president is going to determine whether or not this Constitution is employed the right way.
President Biden in last night's ABC interview making the case for why he needs to remain in the presidential race, rejecting a small course of calls for him to step aside. Joining me now to discuss more, David Jolly, former Republican congressman and MSNBC political analyst, and Amisha Cross, Democratic strategist and a former Obama campaign advisor. My thanks to both of you for joining me this Saturday evening. First off, Amisha, why aren't there calls for Donald Trump to bow out of the race for president? He slept through his New York criminal trial. He can't read from a teleprompter. He babbles, makes up words, and he's a convicted felon.
Because people have normalized Trump's behavior. They have made it okay for Donald Trump to do anything and everything, and for it to be considered completely normal, completely rational. Because Trump operates in that apparatus, and it has worked for him for years. Long before he became president, he was doing wild and crazy things, and throughout his duration as president, he also proceeded to do those same wild and crazy things, up to and including trying to turn our Constitution on its head, trying to, force people to shoot protesters in the streets when the BLM protesters were peacefully protesting in D.C. We saw this man, be impeached twice. We saw him commit 34 felonies and actually be convicted of those things, up to and including also the litany of things related to trying to steal the election in 2020, January 6th insurrection. Nothing that this man has done has stopped the Republican base from standing beside him. Nothing that he has done has quieted the MAGA crowds. Nothing that he has done has really reshaped or recast him as the villain he has happened to be throughout his entire career. And I think that we have come to the conclusion that nothing honestly will. Time and time again, we said, he's not above the law. He's not above the law. Then we saw the law shift to support him, with the Supreme Court basically giving him a kingdom. And I think that, unfortunately, that has become the call to arms, essentially, for those who want to see white supremacy rise, for those who essentially don't want to ever see a Trump presidency end, and for those who want to see an America that is essentially a dictatorship. That's just where we are.
David, there's this old saying, right? Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And I feel like Joe Biden now is being held to impossible standards. I watched that interview. I listened to it. I read the transcript. I mean, I had the time to kind of dissect it. And I thought Biden actually did a great job, because one thing that if I could, Monday morning quarterback George Stephanopoulos about, how many times he's going to ask the same damn question over and over again of Joe Biden? He made the question, posed it to Joe Biden. Joe Biden answered answered the question that he did not have any type of cognitive disability to be able to serve. And Biden answered questions and gave solutions as to what's going on, and yet critics are still railing against his performance last night.
Yeah, Katie, look, I think George Stephanopoulos was trying to penetrate the element of the American fear. I mean, what a lot of Americans saw unsettled them at the debate, and I think Stephanopoulos was trying to push that line, that narrative, as far as he could. But I agree with you, Joe Biden answered, and I think coming out of the Stephanopoulos interview is pretty clear now. First, this issue has to be settled this week. Donald Trump will likely name his vice president. The Republican convention in Milwaukee is about 8 or 9 days away. Democrats cannot go into the next 10 days in absolute chaos. And here's my takeaway. Joe Biden said he can do this job. He said it. He said, I can do this job. I trust Joe Biden. I certainly trust him more than Donald Trump. And so let's go. Joe Biden is the nominee of the Democratic Party. At least he won the primaries. The nomination has to be confirmed by the convention or by the virtual affirmation of the delegates. Joe Biden has said, I'm doing this. Come with me. I think we owe our trust to Joe Biden. It is his greatest strength and certainly the greatest contrast to Donald Trump. So unless Democrats decide to go down a different path, Joe Biden is the guy that can beat Donald Trump. And I think the moment is here where we say, this is the guy that's done it. He tells us to trust him. He can do it again. Let's go with him.
Amisha, before I get back to you, though, I'm going to actually take a little bit of Vice President Kamala Harris's speech right now at Essence Fest in New Orleans. We're going to take a listen to Kamala Harris right now as she speaks.
So look at what they're doing.
I want to pick that up.
And all of this is at stake.
Yes. So you've been on an economic tour. You've been on a reproductive freedom tour. Somewhere in this audience or on the internet is my niece Io, known as Yo-Yo to me. And she is somewhere between 8 and 32 years old. And
right.
One of the things that happened when you became vice president is Io told me that when she becomes president, her platform is going to be ice cream.
All right.
Why do I share that? Because I was excited about Io thinking that she could be president and that ice cream would be the most important issue in the
Alrighty,
country.
so Amisha, we're gonna go back to you right now as some of the questions are going on right now during Vice President Harris's speech over at Essence Fest. Amisha, let's talk about Project 2025. Donald Trump, interestingly, trying to very hard distance himself now from Project 2025. He posted on Truth Social, quote, I know nothing about Project 2025. I have no idea who is behind it. However, President Biden isn't believing a word of it. Today, the Biden campaign issuing a statement saying, quote, Donald Trump is lying again now. He's trying to hide his connection to his allies' extreme Project 2025 agenda. Problem is, it was written for him by those closest to him. I mean, Amisha, is Trump worried about guilt by association? I mean, I don't laugh, either one of you, about that statement, but is Trump worried about guilt by association here?
Finally, yes. I think that this Trump campaign is running very differently than the one that we saw 4 years ago. And quite frankly, the Project 2025 notions kind of crept through after the most recent BET Awards, where, you know, it was stated, just go look it up, basically talking to a Black audience, a younger audience, about what Project 2025 means, the types of things that it will eradicate in this country, up to and including civil rights, and what that means for everyday people. I think that because so many people looked it up after the BET Awards, we know because it was a top trending topic, it became something that the Trump campaign decided, whoa, we want to back away from. But he absolutely was involved and engaged. We heard from the Heritage Foundation president. He's met with the Trump campaign team. Hell, half of the Trump campaign team from 2020, as well as those who were in his administration, were orchestrators of Project 2025. So it's extremely hard to believe that he has no cognition of what this is, in the same way that it was hard for me to believe as a woman watching him speak during the debate about basically trying to recast his ideology on abortion rights. Because Trump knows what's not popular in these streets, so to speak, and he's trying to change his narrative on it, not his policies, but his narrative on it, because he wants to fool the American people. We are smarter than that.
David Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation and one of the key architects of Project 2025, recently said this on Steve Bannon's War Room podcast. Take a really quick listen.
The reason that they are apoplectic right now is because our side is winning. We are in the process of the Second American Revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be.
I mean, David, that's not subtle. right? I mean, how alarming is it for him to be saying this? And again, to Amisha's point, right, this is not thoughts in a vacuum. This is an actual blueprint that they are going to implement.
Dangerous comments by Kevin Roberts, unbefitting of leadership, and should be condemned by Republicans and Democrats alike, and he should be at loss of his leadership position for that. Very dangerous, but it fits the Trumpism narrative, if you will. I think the greatest danger in Project 2025 is not necessarily economic policies, because we've seen those before, right? We're happy to leave behind people so that our side can get rich. Okay, that's wrong. There's economic disparity, moral disparity in that, but it is what it is. The real danger in Project 2025 is the rollback of civil rights, particularly in the area of LGBTQ protections, and then also on the area of reproductive freedom. Those two planks within Project 2025 are remarkably aggressive, and I think that's where Donald Trump is scared, because on the issue of reproductive freedom, Republicans remain woefully out of step with the national temperament on this. Donald Trump knows it. He's somebody, Trump, who is devoid of any ideology. He just wants to do the popular thing. And the popular thing is the Democratic position. So he says, I don't know this Kevin Roberts guy, but he's lying.
Yeah, and Amisha, you know, to your point that you just mentioned a few minutes ago, the American people, they're starting to get even smarter, right? There's some of us that have actually known about Project 2025, we've been talking about it, but when during those BET awards, when she said that about the agenda during those awards, there was this huge uptick in actually researching what Project 2025 is. So what is it going to take for people to be able to understand and really hear the messaging on the dangers of Project 2025?
Well, first and foremost, I think that, you know, Black women have carried American democracy on our backs for quite some time at this point. Taraji P. Henson is one in a long line of people who are out here, you know, fighting the good fight and trying to get folks to recognize the dangers in real time that Donald J. Trump possesses, doing more in many cases than media is doing in terms of elevating that when it's being quaked out by so many other people. That same thing is happening at Essence Fest right now with Vice President Kamala Harris. With that being said, I think that, you know, to make people understand, you have to be where the people are. We know that the average American, the majority of people aren't getting their news from mainstream media anymore. So it is meeting them where they are, whether it's entertainment, whether it's sports, whether it's, you know, in the churches. Where are the people that are going to be voting in this general election cycle, and how do we reach those individuals? And it's got to be void of highbrow policy discussions. It's got to be in the language that they understand, and you have to bring them into the conversation and into the culture. And I think that was something that was done very strongly by Taraji at the BET Awards, but it's also something that's being done strongly by Black women across the country who are marching people and getting them ready for this election cycle and making them understand what is actually at stake.
Which is everything. Everything is at stake. Former Congressman David Jolly and Amisha Cross, thank you so much for being here this evening. I really appreciate both of you. And still to come, a new twist in Donald Trump's legal cases, how the Supreme Court's immunity decision is already working in his favor in the classified documents case and his criminal conviction. You're watching The Saturday Show here on MSNBC. Donald Trump is already using the Supreme Court's immunity ruling to support his favorite legal tactic: delay, delay, delay. This morning, the judge in Trump's classified documents case agreed to a partial stay of the proceedings. She also ordered briefs on whether the Supreme Court's decision merits dismissing Trump's charges. And earlier this week, the judge in Trump's election interference trial postponed his sentencing from next Thursday until at least September 18th. In the meantime, Trump is trying to toss out his conviction, asking that New York court to undo the only criminal accountability he's faced before the November election. Joining me now is MSNBC legal analyst Christy Greenberg. She's a former federal prosecutor and former deputy chief of the Southern District of New York's Criminal Division. Christy, my friend, it's good to have you here. Listen, before we even got started, Judge Cannon, maybe working on a holiday, entering an order denying Walt Nauda's motion to dismiss superseding indictment for selective and vindictive prosecution. I'm not going to get too much into the substance of it. I mean, the short of it is one of Donald Trump's co-defendants gets his motion to dismiss denied, but then again this morning, the judge stayed some important deadlines in that classified documents case so that both sides could brief whether or not that immunity decision from the Supreme Court, now prohibits Jack Smith from prosecuting him. Make it make sense.
Yeah, so deadlines that she has stayed, at least temporarily, are the deadlines that allow Donald Trump to provide reciprocal discovery to the other side and to provide disclosures on experts, things that would be moving the case forward. She said, let's put a hold on that. And the basis, she doesn't give a basis for why she's allowing further briefing on this, but the reasons that were provided by Donald Trump's team as to why this needs to be put on hold don't make a whole lot of sense. They contradict each other. On the one hand, they say Jack Smith is too independent from DOJ leadership, and so, that's one reason why you need to look at this appointments issue further. And then on the other hand, they're saying, well, you also need to put it on hold because he's taking orders, Jack Smith is taking orders from Joe Biden. And those two things seem to be directly contradictory to one another. Either he's completely independent and going wrong, or he's under Joe Biden's thumb. It can't be both. But both of those are reasons that are given here as to why this needs to be put on hold so that there's further briefing on the immunity issue, and also why the litigation just should not be proceeding. Again, further briefing on the SCOTUS decision, that makes a lot of sense. But as to why everything else needs to be shut down, that didn't make a whole lot of sense at all from the briefs.
So it occurred to me, I was, irritated as usual with a lack of any type of progress in the classified documents case. But then again, we haven't had a new trial date in Lord knows how long. But one of the silver linings is this. If Judge Chutkan has to do that analysis now by way of an evidentiary hearing as to what conduct from Donald Trump is criminal, which is official or unofficial, then if Judge Cannon has to do the same thing with the pending indictment that Trump is facing, then maybe we're looking at the possibility, Christy, and I want to get your thoughts on this, of 2 evidentiary hearings being conducted with live testimony in D.C. for his election interference case there, and in Florida for his classified documents espionage case.
Yeah, I certainly think that we will see before this election evidentiary hearings in the D.C. case. I think this has clearly been remanded and sent down to the lower court for those hearings to happen. Judge Chutkan has shown that she is no nonsense. She will move things along. So I think she will do that. I have less optimism that Judge Cannon will do the same. But, it seems like, at least from the briefing schedule that Trump's team proposed on the immunity decision, that they were anticipating briefing into early September. That doesn't give a whole lot of time for her to then hold hearings if she accepts that schedule. But in D.C., I feel optimistic that we'll get those hearings before the election.
Do you carry any of that optimism into the idea that the fake elector scheme from the election interference case in D.C. and those that are being pursued in other jurisdictions, do you share any optimism that they actually will be deemed to be unofficial acts by Donald Trump, and therefore he will not receive immunity for that criminal conduct?
So Donald Trump's lawyer in the oral argument before the Supreme Court seemed to concede that was private conduct, and the Supreme Court kind of said, well, no, it's still an open question. But I was encouraged, at least by Justice Barrett in her concurrence, saying Donald Trump's attempts to organize these fake electors, that is plainly private conduct, and it's not entitled to immunity. I can't see where they would find presidential authority to influence how the states are actually appointing their electors. It just seems so far afield from anything that they could develop in these evidentiary hearings that I do share the optimism that conduct will go forward in D.C. as well as in the Georgia case.
Christy Greenberg, thanks for joining us tonight. I always appreciate your insight. And coming up next, growing calls to reform that United States Supreme Court following the historic and controversial immunity ruling. But what would it really take to make that happen? I'm going to ask one of the people behind a major new reform effort when we come back. The Supreme Court's attacks on democracy this term are fueling increasingly urgent calls for reform. In just the past 2 weeks, the High Court has stripped power from federal agencies, made it easier to bribe state officials, and awarded the president king-like authority with its immunity ruling. Reform advocates are now launching a $10 million campaign to make overhauling the Supreme Court a key issue this election. The progressive group Demand Justice is planning a range of activities, including mobilizing women and other voters whose rights are most most at risk from this court. Joining me now is Skye Perryman, the president and CEO of Democracy Forward. She's also the senior advisor for Demand Justice. Skye, it's always so good to spend time with you. I mean, you know, just when we were reeling with the overruling of 40 years of Chevron and deference to administrative agencies, we get slammed with that immunity ruling. And I can't believe it was just 6 days ago. It feels like it was a long time ago. Certainly calls for reform at the Supreme Court. That's nothing new. But why is it just so important now for actually something to be done?
Well, you know, Katie, if this term is not a clear indication of what is at stake in this moment in our democracy, I don't know what else is. But our nation and our freedoms are in crisis, and the majority of justices on this Supreme Court are actually accelerating that crisis, not doing what the courts are supposed to do, which is to protect our democracy, protect our democratic institutions, and protect the freedoms of the American people. So this is really a pivotal inflection point in a moment in our country, and it is essential that we start using the tools that our very own Constitution provides to push back on this extremism.
So, Skye, the priorities for Demand Justice are expansion of the court, the setting of term limits, and an enforcement of an ethics code. These things sound all noble and things that would all make sense, and yet talk to the viewers, talk to us about how we can make those things happen.
Right. Well, this is not time for cynicism. It's time for action. And what we know is that the fact that the court is not protecting the American people is getting a lot of attention from ordinary Americans. The court's approval rating is at a historic low. And our Constitution provides we, the people, ordinary people in America, the tools to make their voices heard. It is Congress that has the tools to set policy and reform the judiciary, both at the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary. And that is one of the things that Demand Justice will be focused on, is really empowering ordinary Americans to make their voices heard in this time, to push their elected lawmakers to fix this crisis, and to save our democracy in the process.
And how important is it then, Skye, for candidates like Joe Biden, for example, to emphasize his commitment to the idea that reform of the highest court in the land is something that should be a focus of his next administration?
Well, I think you have certainly seen the president, both in the State of the Union and then recently this past week, talk about the real harms that we are experiencing to our freedoms and to our country as a result of far-right extremism that is unfortunately very prevalent in the majority of the Supreme Court. It's really important that the American people be making their voices heard and that their lawmakers hear them. So that will be a big priority over the next few months.
And, you know, Skye, this didn't happen overnight. I think people need to understand, right, that this is the culmination of decades of investments of dark money into the courts, into the judiciary. It's been the investment of conservatives trying to, in a very insidious way, plant the seeds to be able to end up with the type of super conservative majority that you see on SCOTUS. So in the immediate sense, what should Americans be looking to?
Well, one, we need to make sure that everyone understands who is behind this extremism at the court. And as you noted, Katie, it is a large, highly coordinated network of far-right extremists that do not represent what the vast majority of the American people believe, but that nevertheless are intent, whether through Project 2025 or whether through what they want to do at the court. They are intent on forcing an unpopular agenda, on depriving us of our freedoms, and on really undermining what this country stands for in our Constitution. And so first of all, understanding, like you said, this is not a fluke. It's not a historical accident. This was the culmination of a long plan, and it is still going. I saw your earlier segment on 2025. The second thing is to make sure ordinary Americans understand that their voices matter. It is, in fact, we the people in this crisis that can help save our democracy. That is what our Constitution provides. And so that is what we are going to be focused on, making investments around to really elevate these issues at this critical moment for the country.
And you know, and Sky, as I say goodbye to you, one thing that I think is important for people to remember is look how the midterms turn out for Democrats, right? And look at how many abortion initiatives have made it to the ballot in so many different states. It's because when people actually exercise, you know, their investment in democracy, they do have a voice, and collectively they get things done. Sky Perryman, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And coming up, founding father Thomas Jefferson warned us about the threat of dictatorship. That threat remains so relevant right now. We're going to break it all down with NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss after this.
This is probably the most significant election of our lifetime. You know, we have said it every 4 years, but this here one is it.
That was Vice President Kamala Harris just moments ago at the Essence Festival in New Orleans, underscoring the importance of this election, especially after this very consequential week. The same week the U.S. celebrated its 248th Independence Day, President Biden facing calls from some Democrats to bow out of the presidential race amidst fears that he could lose to Trump in November. In addition, the Supreme Court's conservative majority ruled that Trump has some immunity from prosecution for his, quote, official acts as president. Dissenting liberal justices say this decision elevates the American president to a king, something the founding fathers fought passionately against. Earlier this week, NBC presidential historian Michael Beschloss pointed out that Thomas Jefferson warned it was only a matter of time before Americans were tempted by dictatorship. Jefferson also called on future Americans to ward off the wolf of tyranny. Michael Beschloss joins me now. Michael, it's always so good to spend time with you. I want you to unpack that tweet a little bit more for us. Unpack that tweet, because what was Jefferson specifically referring to when he was talking about the wolf of tyranny?
Well, he said, and he said it somewhat in that statement in the mid-1780s, he said, you know, we've constructed a democracy. That's what we've been fighting for, our independence from a king of England. But he said, I know enough about human nature to know that there are a lot more kings and dictatorships in world history than there are governments like the one that we're trying to construct. And he said, one day, and it may not be too distant, he said, Americans will be tempted by someone who wants to become a dictator and says, I alone can do it all. I can relieve your problems. I'm much more efficient than a government with the presidency and a Congress and a Supreme Court. And he said, resist that wolf of tyranny.
You know, after the Supreme Court ruled that President Trump has some immunity, Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote in her dissent, never in the history of our republic has a president had reason to believe that he would be immune from criminal prosecutions if he used the trappings of his office to violate the criminal law. Justice Sotomayor went on to write, the president is now a king above the law. I mean, Michael, so much is now at stake now, is it not? I mean, now you have the kind of the cloak of legal presumptive immunity when it comes to a lot of conduct by a president sitting in the Oval Office, allegedly doing things under, again, the cloak of official acts. How important then, we just heard Kamala Harris say it, the vice president, this is really when it counts, right?
It's paramount, and Americans are in trouble in a way that we weren't a week ago because of the Supreme Court decision. The problem was never that presidents were not powerful enough. Presidents already had too much power. But now what the Supreme Court has said is almost every president who makes a decision like, you know, assassinating another leader, or God forbid, having a political opponent murdered by agents of the American government, or telling the Attorney General to prosecute someone that you don't like because he's called you a bad name as president, all that, if deemed an official act, is legal. And presidents do a lot of official acts that we do not hear about. So one constraint that has been crucial, which is fear of prosecution after a president leaves office, that is almost gone. And if you have a president who has contempt for the law, I'm not going to mention any names, and comes into power, that person will be a dictatorship and will laugh at the idea that he will be prosecuted later for almost anything.
Michael, give us a little bit of some historical context as well, we look at an inflection point, I think, in American history when Richard Nixon stepped down, right? And then he got pardoned. And we look at that time in history and we say, that's a bad man doing bad things that are criminal in nature. Maybe it was a mistake to pardon him because, you know, at the end of the day, he was never criminally prosecuted for it. And,
Which
and
I
again,
believe.
we can Monday...
Yeah.
Exactly, and we can Monday morning quarterback the wisdom of what happened back then.
Sure.
But has what happened this past week with the Supreme Court and the immunity decision effectively eradicated kind of any moral compass or any type of kind of moral kind of compass that we would be looking to when it comes to history? Because we've always looked at that Nixon event as being that is when you know that presidents are not above the law, and yet now we have a Supreme Court that's saying, you know what, we've reconsidered that.
The presidential immunity decision of the Supreme Court means that now it's thrown on all of us to make sure that no one ever becomes president who does not have the high character to resist the temptation to do things like have your opponents killed or subdue the Defense Department or use the Justice Department for cheap political ends or try to suspend the Constitution or become dictator for a day. It's now on the voters to keep someone like that out. It shouldn't be. We once had a Congress that might impeach and convict a president. That's never happened, so impeachment is toothless. We once had a Supreme Court that would say to Richard Nixon, as it did in 1974, you've got to give up your tapes and you can't obstruct justice. Instead, given the ruling this week, I am quite certain if that were in effect in 1974, Richard Nixon would have gotten off and he would have served for 8 years, and that would be the lesson for all of us.
Michael Beschloss, as always, thank you so much for sharing your insight. It's good to see you, my friend.
Thank you. Same, Katie. Thank you, my friend.
And more of the Saturday Show on MSNBC after a quick break.